This is 7 Minutes Cyber with Danny Lawlor of Aquest and myself, Sam Glynn of Code in Motion. And the 7 minutes start now.
So for this video, it's a continuation of a previous video that we did where we looked at outsourcing from the perspective of both the regulated firm, but particularly also what is going to be asked of a provider, a RegTech provider, or otherwise who's going to sell their services or their product or whatever into a regulated firm. So in that first video, we looked at some of the general requirements with both Sam and myself acting as if we were working for the regulated firm in a legal compliance perspective or outsourcing from some perspective on my side, and Sam obviously on the technology side. So for this video, we want to focus on the questions that Sam would ask where we're looking at the information security of the firm that we're proposing to hire to sell services into this regulated firm. So Sam, when you go and visit this firm that we're proposing to take on, what are the key questions that you're asking of them to make sure us as a regulated firm are doing what we need to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it depends on the nature of the outsourced service. How risky is it? What you would do in terms of the company that does the catering versus the company that's going to do your annual accounts would be quite different. But if it's a RegTech or FinTech or IT provider, what usually happens is they have access to a lot of sensitive data. They may have more access into systems than the company themselves if they provide the IT managed service. So you'd start in a kind of an iterative assessment. So at a very high level, you would start with very plain English conversations about, well, tell me what you do about IT security. What's your attitude? What's the culture? Just to get a sense of that. And then you kind of go down, peel the onion into much more detailed kind of deep dives into areas where they don't seem to understand what they're doing. They haven't given you confidence. But all of this is really feeding into a more detailed assessment, which you may or may not reveal to the service provider, depending on how they're positioned. But you can use external benchmarks or external frameworks or external questionnaires, which will give you an objective view of how secure this provider is. So things like the SIG questionnaire can be 300 to 1,800 questions digging into the security posture of a firm. If it's a cloud security piece, it could be, or a cloud service, it could be the Cloud Security Alliance of questionnaires. So it isn't, your assessment is only as good as the assessor. Your assessment can be as good as the industry benchmark is around what is good security. In terms of what reg firms, sorry, say that again, Danny.
What would be the gold standard when you come to look at a firm and look at their information security?
Yeah, I mean, ISO is always kind of a globally recognized standards organization and standards framework. And when it comes to IT security and information security, 27,000, the set of standards there would be, I suppose, something that's very difficult to argue against. It is a very finer detail of what it takes to manage information security, which is broader than cybersecurity and broader than IT security. But if a firm has the right scoped certification against ISO 27001, then usually that should give you a hell of a lot of confidence that they know what they're doing. And like we were talking about in the first video, that they have the organizational structure and governance to keep doing the right things.
Yeah.
But the key thing with ISO, if someone does say they're certified, the key question is to ask, well, what's the scope of that? What's the statement of applicability? Because if the firm wants to get ISO certified, they can define the scope. If that scope doesn't cover all of the things that the reg firm is actually expecting the provider to do, then the ISO certification isn't good enough because there are gaps.
And so if it's not ISO certification, what other things could a firm do to satisfy the likes of yourself that they're on top of information security and that they're not going to let you down as a regulated firm?
I think, again, you look at what the firm is doing and where they are in their journey, as the phrase would go. So, I mean, if they're starting out and what they're doing for you is not very risky, if they start talking about aligning to, again, other industry benchmarks like the SANS 20 or the CIS 20 critical controls, the Cyber Essentials, which is in the UK, but again, is a pretty pragmatic kind of way to align yourself to an industry accepted standard. Or if they're American, the NIST standards, which are similar, kind of in between, but maybe closer to ISO. But in all cases, it's the firm showing that they're committed to security and that they're continuously improving their posture. So that at least the day that you sign up for them, if you choose to do so, you know where you stand And if it's not quite where you want it to be, but it's okay for day one, then at least you can continue to have conversations with them about the journey they're on to make sure they're getting to where they need to be.
So I guess the follow-up question is then, what are the red flags that you would see and immediately be very concerned about and possibly end the discussions if you were engaging with a firm to provide services?
You know, in that initial conversation, they don't have someone that can talk about security in a professional way. You know, if you mention certain terminology and they don't understand what that term means, if they can't explain why they haven't aligned themselves to some kind of benchmark, you know, they can't give you a good story, then that's all kind of red flags to me. I mean, security isn't something where you go, well, the head of operations can deal with that, or well, we don't do IT internally, it's an IT managed service provider, so they deal with it. None of those things are good enough. You know, there needs to be ownership. Back to what you were talking about in the governance episode, there needs to be people on the ground that have their head around this, because it does take time and it does take expertise.
Yeah. And then just lastly, so ISO 27000 information security. We're in the last minute.
Yeah.
Briefly then, what's the differences between information security and IT security and cybersecurity?
Well, information is, you know, it could be information, paper files. It could be information sitting in an office. So we all have, you know, most offices, you have swipe cards and you have ways of getting into a secure facility or not. That is all about information security. IT security would be a subset of that, because some of the information, or these days most of the information, is sitting on some kind of information technology. So it's about the security around that information technology. And then cybersecurity is a kind of a mixed term. People use cybersecurity when they talk about IT security, but depending on how you look at it, cyber is really about, you know, systems that are accessible from the cyber world, systems that are on the internet, which I suppose is most systems these days. But you know, it could exclude certain information technology. It certainly excludes things like physical security around office buildings and stuff.
That's our 7 minutes.
You know, to wrap it up after our 7 minutes, you know, it's back to your first episode. Security takes time. It takes investment of time upfront and ongoing investment. So the key thing is, if you're outsourcing to a service provider, have they got the people? Have they got the skills?
I guess if you're the provider, the key thing is get ahead of this. Don't let that be the first time you've directed some attention to it.
When you have the answer. Have the answer before you're asked.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks very much, Sam.